Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Mike for a wonderful conference and all those who have volunteered to help put on such a very well-run and really excellent first-rate conference, and I'm very pleased to be here. I should just mention before I start that the title of my talk is slightly misleading now. I do discuss the campus sexual assault tribunals near the end of the paper, but I got interested in setting the context for these sexual assault tribunals, the general demonization of young men on university campuses, and then that sort of took over the paper. So there's a lot about that at the beginning, and I was worried that many of you will know a lot of this stuff, and you probably know it as well as I do or better, but it's still somehow fascinating and important, I think, to speak about. Okay, so there we go. So an article in the Times Higher Education magazine, used to be the Times Higher Education Supplement, from May 10th, 2018, reported that women are significantly outflanking men in university education worldwide, and I'm sure that doesn't surprise very many people here. To focus on the UK in particular, according to UK government statistics, women under 30 have an 11.9% advantage over men when it comes to higher educational attainment, and those who are doing worst in the UK are working class white men. Only 10% of young white men from poor backgrounds go on to post-secondary education. And the question, of course, is, does anybody beyond the people in this room really care very much? Certainly the author of this article in the Times Higher Education magazine couldn't figure out whether, or at least the framer of the subtitle there, couldn't figure out whether it was a victory for gender equality, why it would be a victory is anybody's guess, or a problem worth caring about. In fact, of course, for many feminists, men's underperformance is something to celebrate, and to celebrate quite overtly. This was already mentioned by Professor Eric Anderson a couple days ago, but worth mentioning again, I think. This was June 8th, 2018. An angry feminist named Susanna Walters published an op-ed in the Washington Post hoping that men would voluntarily disappear from the corridors of power. And surely it is no coincidence, and that's really my argument, that men are disappearing from university classrooms as denunciations such as Walters are being published with increasing frequency, I must say. The article was titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And in it, Walters claimed that such hatred is logical and presumably morally justified because men are collectively responsible for the litany of violence, and I won't go through all the things. She includes the fact that women do most of the unpaid emotional labor in our societies. And in a rhetorical move that has become typical of the Andrea Dworkin wing of feminist man-blaming, Walters asserted that guilt for male domination and oppression doesn't belong only to some men, but to every man. Why? For failing to stop it. So that's what she says there. But truly, if he were with us, wouldn't this all have ended a long time ago? If he really were with us, wouldn't he reckon that one good way to change structural violence and inequity would be to refuse the power that comes with us? Now, how you could challenge something and end it by giving up power is beyond me, but logic isn't one of the issues that Professor Walters is strong on in this article. In fact, the whole article is so badly written. It's one of the things that is most striking to me, the banality, the lack of either rational or stylistic clarity, the commonplace, trite cliches, and this in a once respectable newspaper. And she concludes that the only decent thing for a man to do is to concede power to feminist women and get out of the way. And that's the last paragraph there. So men, if you really are with us and would like us to not hate you for all the millennia of woe you have produced and benefited from, start with this. Lean out so we can actually just stand up without being beaten down. Pledge to vote for feminist women only. Don't run for office. Don't be in charge of anything. I'd like it if the men all stepped down from being in charge of the electrical grid and see what Susanna Walters had to say about that. Step away from the power. Well, now, I'm sure that very few in this room are at all surprised that a once respectable newspaper would publish a statement of such demented hatred. Unfortunately, this is no longer a cause for surprise. I do think it is somewhat remarkable, or at least notable, that Susanna Walters is a university professor of sociology and feminist studies, and unfortunately, not just any university professor. She's not a tenured kook that, they can't get rid of. She is the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Northeastern University in Boston, and she's the editor of the academic journal Signs, which is maybe the most, if not at least one of the most prestigious gender studies journals in academia. Her rant is not the personal expression of a woman pushed to the limits of sanity by some kind of life crisis, unleashing an atypical outburst. As she herself says, at the bottom of the page there, if you can see it, she herself indicates when she praises the radical feminists for whom she's always had a soft spot. She's part of a long-standing tradition that has been fully embraced by universities in the Western world and is still very much alive and well, and not only in the gender studies departments, though of course they are the beating heart of academic feminism, but equally, I would say, or nearly equally, in the social sciences as a whole, in the faculty of law, in health sciences, certainly in the humanities, and even in STEM now. Walters' sanctioned fury is the fruit of decades of feminist theorizing that has recast the entire history of the human race as a plot by all men, or depending on your brand of feminism, only all white, heterosexual, able-bodied Christian and property-owning men, to oppress and to subjugate and to enslave and to disempower and to brutalize, slander, torment, and dehumanize all women, or depending on your brand of feminism, some poor white women, but especially Black, Muslim, lesbian, and gender non-conforming women. Of course, not everyone in academia supports Walters' view, but most do either enthusiastically or tacitly. But here's one standout, Professor Mark Perry from the University of Michigan. A few weeks after the rant that was published in the Washington Post, this economics professor from the University of Michigan requested a Title IX investigation of Professor Walters. Title IX is the anti-gender discrimination statute that applies to all education institutions in the United States. So he's asking that her teaching be reviewed in light of this open declaration of hatred. And so he asks, how would it be possible for Walters to publicly state that she hates all men and not discriminate against them, any more than a KKK racist who gives herself the right to hate all blacks or gays would not likely discriminate against those groups? And he goes on, how could a male student ever expect fair, just, and equitable treatment while taking a class from Professor Walters? How could a male faculty colleague applying for tenure and or promotion in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology expect fair treatment from Professor Walters? And indeed, how could anyone hope for fair treatment from a proud, self-declared bigot? Now, this whole question of Title IX challenges, which is it's an interesting idea that Professor Perry has launched. Apparently, he is making Title IX claims against a number of professors and departments for discriminating against men. So this is a very interesting issue. We can maybe talk about it more in the Q&A, and the whole question of lawsuits and whether those are the way to go. I'm uncertain. I have my reservations about that as a strategy for activism. Unfortunately, even if Susanna Walters were to be investigated and disciplined in some manner, which I highly doubt that she will, but even if she were, I don't think it would make much difference to the anti-male culture at universities in general. Walters is not in any way an outlier. There are literally thousands like her, and I do mean literally. I've met them at university conferences. I've spoken to them personally in the days before I was a declared anti-feminist. I've seen them in action on university committees. I've read their articles in the thousands, and they make no they don't attempt to hide their animus against men collectively. They make public declarations about their eagerness to discriminate against men, and nothing bad happens to them in their careers. In fact, they are honored and promoted to positions of power as a result. Many of them are declared activists who have no respect for the erstwhile academic ideal of disinterested inquiry. They make activism an inseparable part of their teaching and research, and as I say, they are rewarded for it. So what I want to do today briefly is look at just a representative few of such professors in diverse areas, and to ask implicitly, as Professor Perry asked, how could any male student or colleague, or indeed any non-feminist student of either sex, expect fair treatment from such a person? And how is it that such teachers are collecting massive salaries for their hateful, prejudiced views and practices? And I really want to stress that these are not individuals in the sense of, isolated people. These are people at the center of large networks, significant networks of like-minded activists. They support one another, they strategize together, they nominate one another for positions, they nominate one another and grant to one another, research grants and stipends and all sorts of positions of influence and power. So here's one of my favorites. This is Professor Lise Gotell. And in 2016, this professor, who is a feminist legal activist and professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Alberta, she published an academic paper called Sexual Violence in the Manosphere: Anti-Feminist Men's Rights Discourses on Rape, and it was published in the International Journal for Crime, Justice, and Democracy. In that article, amongst other things, she looks at a lot of men's rights websites, and can't find a single thing on which men's rights are correct about anything. And she defended her role in this paper in a campaign called Don't Be That Guy, that started in Alberta in coordination with the Alberta police forces, and then spread to many university campuses across the country. And this campaign was essentially designed to lecture men about their propensity to rape. And Professor Gotell claims to have been incredulous that anyone could misinterpret the campaign as a slur on men. She said that the posters, quote, challenge the social norm of male sexual entitlement. Now, wait a minute, I think I went ahead too far. Yeah, sorry, there it is at the bottom. She said the ads challenge the social norm of male sexual entitlement, that feminist cliche, and seek to delegitimize common excuses for sexual assault. So in Professor Guttel's fantastical worldview, it is socially acceptable for men to think themselves entitled to women's bodies and therefore necessary for women like her to call them out on their Neanderthalism. And so here are some of the so-called challenges that the campaign mounted to the supposedly common and socially sanctioned excuses that men use to rape. So these are some of them. It's not sex when she's passed out. Just because she isn't saying no doesn't mean she's saying yes with an unconscious woman. Just because you helped her home, that's the one at the far corner here, doesn't mean you get to help yourself. So crude in the formulation. Picture of a man helping a staggering woman to his car. He's about to take her to his home in order to assault her, of course. None of the posters shows men being coerced into sex by women, and in fact, none of the posters in highly multicultural Canada shows any perpetrator other than a white man. Yet Guttel was indignant at the minor backlash to the posters, which she found deeply disturbing. She asserted that the posters did not stigmatize men and did not suggest that men are in general so brutal and stupid that they need to be educated to the fact that an unconscious woman can't be a willing sexual partner. And so this was her, that was her response to Karen Strawn's depiction. She said, this campaign's emphasis on men was not meant to construct all men as rapists, but instead to stigmatize perpetrators. But she doesn't make a distinction between men and perpetrators, and to educate men about consent. So, righto. I'm glad she cleared that up. Imagine being a non-feminist man in Professor Guttel's classes on feminism and sexual assault. She's a true ideologue, unable even to imagine what radical feminism feels like to the targets of its rage. Now, around the same time that Professor Guttel was defending her narrative about female innocent victimization and male brutality, Professor Judy Haven was also championing female students in her classes. In 2015, Professor Haven participated in a panel discussion at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, to discuss campus misogyny. Haven teaches in the Sobey School of Business at St. Mary's University and is the head of an HR management and training firm called Better Workplaces Consulting. And during the panel discussion, she expressed her belief that because of the supposedly rampant structural misogyny on university campuses, it should be university policy for female students to speak first in every university classroom and at all public events on campus. And she said that this is a policy that she practices in her own classrooms, and according to reports on the event, her statement was met with a round of enthusiastic applause. And just for interest's sake, I looked up Professor Haven on Rate My Professor, which of course is not necessarily the most objective catalog of student comments. I hear that I've got some pretty bad ones up there too. But anyway, I immediately found, I didn't have to look past the first one, I immediately found a comment confirming that indeed she does practice this women first classroom policy. This student who wasn't pleased with it said, I ended up dropping the class even though I couldn't get my money back. She is extremely boring and doesn't let men speak until a woman has tried to answer. She also sends out multiple emails a day about her protests and shoves her ideas down your throat. Very annoying. But the fact, of course, that Professor Haven can be completely transparent about her discriminatory policy and receive applause for it indicates the prevalence of anti-male animus at universities. In the same year that Professor Haven and her colleagues were deploring the male propensity to engage in university academic discussion, in that same year, City University London journalism professor and director of the master's program, Connie St. Louis, claimed she had been very badly treated by a racist, sexist nation after she was found to have radically misrepresented the remarks of cancer researcher and Nobel Prize winner Sir Timothy Hunt at a science journalism luncheon in Seoul, Korea. St. Louis had taken only one part, you probably all know this better than I, had taken only one part of Sir Tim Hunt's comments at this luncheon, the joking part where he talked about his trouble with girls in the lab. She'd taken that and tweeted it as if it were the whole of his pre-luncheon speech. He had a part where he said, "but seriously," and went on to speak about, you know, the tremendous contributions that women were making in science. But she had claimed that the self-deprecating remarks represented the entire speech and that no one had laughed at his appalling misogyny, although other people reported that everybody recognized it was a joke and had chuckled. Then she went on BBC One's program, The Big Questions, and claimed that as a result of her campaign to have Sir Tim professionally and socially destroyed, and she was essentially, at least in the moment, she was certainly successful in that campaign. As a result of that, she had been victimized. She claimed to have been sent pictures of monkeys in trees and told to go back to the jungle, though she never produced a single one of these hateful messages, and stated that this country is just as racist, just as white male privileged as it has always been. Just a little bit angry there. In January of 2016, professor of English at Columbian College at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and director of the Institute for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, participated in a sustained online attack on a retired professor of medieval studies named Alan Franson, who was a hitherto highly regarded scholar of medievalism. Now, what had Franson done in retirement that deserved a sustained barrage of Twitter denunciation and vitriolic blog posts and accusatory articles? Well, he had started a blog. There he is. He'd started a blog about men's issues and anti-feminism. And one of the early articles that he posted on this blog was called How to Fight Your Way Out of the Feminist Fog, and he called it FemFog for short. I found his I went and read a number of his posts and found them funny and very perceptive. He made the argument, the not particularly shocking or surprising argument, that the goal of feminism is to remove men from power, and that most men are afraid to question feminism. I think such claims are pretty easily defended, but for advancing that argument in his retirement and for using a phrase such as FemFog, he had to be metaphorically destroyed by his former colleagues, all for the good of women, of course. So this is what J.J. Cohen said in his own defense for leading this campaign to vilify Franson. What Franson published online and what many others say and do that aligns with his call to eradicate feminism is toxic to everyone, but especially to young female scholars who are that field's best future. They are the ones we need to make room for. And if it means loudly and publicly condemning misogyny and anti-feminism, although there is no misogyny in Professor Franson's post, but condemning misogyny and anti-feminism wherever it erupts, sign me up for every departing bandwagon. Well, in an earlier era, it would have been quite astounding to see a professor of medievalism declaring his enthusiastic dedication to joining every social smear bandwagon going. But unfortunately, that That enthusiasm is an apt description of what most ideologically committed professors do these days and think it their sacred duty. In March of 2017, University of Calgary English professor Rebecca Sullivan was brought on to CBC television, which is the baby equivalent of the BBC, as an expert analyst to discuss an attempted showing by a student group at the University of Calgary of Cassie Jay's film, The Red Pill. Though it was, the film was never able to be shown, and it was quite clear from everything that Professor Sullivan had to say that she had not done any serious investigation of the men's rights movement and hadn't even seen the film. But she had no hesitation in condemning it, and she claimed on national television with a derisive chuckle and no pushback from the host that the main message of the men's rights movement is, if only we could have sex with whoever, I think it should be whomever, but anyway, whoever and whatever we want, whenever we want, then maybe we wouldn't have to rape you. I guess, she and Professor Guttell need to get together on another poster campaign to tell men that you just can't do that. In the same month that Professor Sullivan was displaying her contempt for men, Professor Roz Kelsey, an instructor in kinesiology and health studies at the University of Regina and the chair of a campus program called Man Up Against Violence, organized something called the Masculinity Confession Booth, which was a place for students to confess sins of masculinity. From Monday, March 27th through Thursday, March 30th, students were told that we have all reinforced hypermasculinity one way or another, regardless of our gender. Come and share your sins so we can begin to discuss how to identify and change our ways. According to the Man Up Against Violence website, the initiative seeks to, I'm not sure if I've got this on the next slide. Oh yeah, there it is. The initiative seeks to raise awareness around healthy masculinity and provide opportunities for education with the goal of increasing involvement of men in the cause, and the feminist cause, and challenge the damaging effects of socialized hypermasculinity, ergo reducing violence in our communities. And as many of you probably know, programs like this, I don't think there's another masculinity confession booth, but certainly programs to help men overcome toxic masculinity are now quite widespread on university campuses across North America. Any young man who objects to that general vilification of masculinity will have a very unpleasant time. And I actually wish I had asked Professor Anderson when he was talking about the different way that men now identify as in terms of relation to masculinity. I wish I had asked him whether young men's lack of strong identification with masculinity has anything to do with the fact that over the past 20 years at least, and certainly in a heightened way over the past 10 years, feminist culture has been telling men repeatedly that masculinity is a terrible thing. Okay, my last example. There are so many, but I could only choose a few. In April of 2017, a magazine called Inside Higher Ed published an article by an anonymous sociology professor called Surviving Rape Apologists in the Classroom. And I would recommend this paper to anybody who wonders what goes on in sociology classrooms, because it is amazing. It is amazing. She talks about how through discussing rape culture, some students in the class come to realize that they've been raped. Imagine that, coming to realize through your professor's discussion that you've been raped, and others come to realize that they have raped. But some men still resist. Some men still resist. So she talked about her traumatic experience as a rape survivor of having to grade a paper by a student arguing against the feminist theory of rape culture. And she considered this a violation akin to rape itself, and made no secret of the fact that objectivity was impossible in such a case. And she says, none of my training or experience prepared me for something like this, to have a man disagree with her. Not even advice from the few feminist scholars I've had the pleasure of knowing. I found that very hard to believe. I was in a position where I had to take this student's words seriously, evaluate their merit, and provide a percentile score based on how well I thought they fit the parameters of the assignment. 0. You get a fucking 0. I literally screamed at my computer screen. I imagined him sitting on the other side of his computer screen, laughing at my pain, joking about my distress. How, I wondered, could I possibly evaluate this student's work in an unbiased fashion? Such a request would involve me living an entirely different life than the one I ever had. And one doesn't know where to begin. In the end, according to the author, she did manage to grade the paper. And of course, readers are obviously meant to applaud the enormous heroism of such an action. But I don't think any of us is left with the impression that she would, or even felt that she should, have graded the paper objectively. Feminism, of course, has long claimed that objectivity is just another patriarchal construct and not something a feminist should even strive for. And when you live in a world in which 1 in 3 women is subject to unspeakable sexual violence, why would you aim for objectivity in the classroom? And that's the whole problem that we're facing. So in this atmosphere of sustained contempt for men, and delusional conviction of women's oppression and male violence, it's no surprise that the investigation of male students accused of sexual misconduct has become a state-funded opportunity to shame and punish young men en masse for all manner of non-criminal but ostensibly forbidden conduct. As many of you know, in 2011, a Dear Colleague guidance document was issued by President Obama's Office of Civil Rights to all universities and colleges. It alleged that sexual misconduct, understood in the broadest possible manner, is a form of gender discrimination that must be investigated and punished as a Title IX violation. In other words, as an infringement on female students' right to pursue their education without discrimination. The Dear Colleague document, it's really worth reading, especially the question and answer sub-document that's attached to the Dear Colleague letter. It gave investigators the right to oversee and make judgments on all facets of students' sexual lives, all in the name of protecting female students, regardless of the fact that most academics, of course, have no legal training whatsoever in investigative procedures, in the examination of witnesses, or the evaluation of evidence. On pain of losing their federal funding, universities were required to show that they were responding to allegations of sexual harassment promptly and decisively, and of course, most were very happy to do so. During the investigations and hearings, due process protections for the accused were entirely disregarded. It was not required that accused students have lawyers present. Some universities did allow them to have, many didn't. And accused students were not allowed to cross-examine, their accusers. As the document cautions, this is my favorite moment in the document, allowing an alleged perpetrator to question an alleged victim directly may be traumatic or intimidating, thereby possibly escalating or perpetuating a hostile environment. In coming to a judgment, schools were instructed to use a preponderance of evidence standard, meaning it need only be determined that the alleged misconduct was more likely than not to have occurred. And in an environment where, schools suspected rightly that it was a lot safer to err on the side of harshness than on the side of caution, Many students were expelled from universities as a result of allegations of misconduct for which they were never criminally investigated or charged. Though the Dear Colleague letter was withdrawn in 2017 under the Trump administration, unfortunately, though, it will take years for new binding regulations to be put in place. Many universities are going to resist all the way through the courts. And in the meantime, the vast majority of universities under the sway of feminist ideologues are continuing the practices that they adopted under Obama. Unfortunately, I think it would take a veritable flood of successful lawsuits to change this one aspect of the anti-male culture of the university. And although there have been a very large number of successful suits in the United States, I think it's the fact that our side has nowhere near the resources, the energy, and the organizational clout that feminists and their allies can command. Even if we can win this one battle over the use of Title IX to persecute male students, the attacks on men as men and the implementation of feminist policies to discriminate against them will continue, certainly, for years to come. In my opinion, and I am a glass half empty sort of gal, so take it with a grain of salt, but in my opinion, the universities are lost to us. The universities, of course, they are those institutions that create the feminist foot soldiers who go on to become our primary school teachers, our journalists, our cultural commentators, our experts in a whole range of spheres, our academic researchers, our human resources managers, our policy makers, our social workers, I already said that one, in many cases, our politicians. I think they're dead. Our only hope in the present is the building of alternative structures to educate and credential our young people. But what a task that is, and how that is to be done is the urgent question that confronts us now, I think. Thank you very much.
Hi, I have maybe a very difficult question for you. I'm wondering, where does the hate come from in the feminist group? Is it a toxic kind of mem thing? Is it disappointment or hate because of bad fathering? Is it what actually does it come from? What's your thoughts about that?
I'm no better equipped to answer that than anyone, really. Although I've certainly thought about it a great deal over the last 10 years or so. I think. Well, of course, one can't get inside the heads of all of these ideologues. But if you truly believe that the entire history of the human race is the history of men, a conscious plot by men to oppress women, to subjugate them, to belittle them, to demean them, to objectify them, etc., it's pretty hard not to hate that group, I think. And it's a very exhilarating feeling. It feels really good to be able to hate with impunity and to make that the ground of your existence. The other side of that hatred, of course, is love of yourself as a perfectly pure, innocent victim. So it gives you license to do all sorts of rude things, undercover that this is a bold blow against hegemonic masculinity. It gives you the right to make unfounded allegations. It gives you the right to make sweeping statements castigating an entire person group with very little blowback. It gives you the right to silence a whole room. When you tell your story of victimization, there's a very heady rush that comes along with that hatred, and with the loss of personal responsibility. You're not responsible for anything that's wrong with the world. It's their problem. That's a very good feeling too.
And the power.
It gives a great deal of power. Many of these ideologues have made, this is their whole career. They would lose their reputation, they would lose their very nice, secure salaries, and they would also lose the ground of their being. And it is a very satisfying ground.
Thank you.
Janice, hey.
Klaus Zinsel. I liked your comment about the electrical grid. But looking more on the economic points, for example, if countries are dealing with people in a very bad way, or let's say you are from the university and you said it could go worse that all people have to stay away from university to get a good education, is there a ranking? Is there a possibility to say, hey, I prefer this university, I go to this polytechnic, something like this, or I study in this country, because there I can be sure to get a good education, to get a good qualification, and can have a safe study instead of going to this university who is completely gender-driven. Is there a possibility to have such a kind of ranking or ruling?
It would be possible if there were any universities that, declared themselves non-feminist, and I would hope that there would be some. I think there's one university in the United States. What's the name of it, David? I'm blanking on it. The famous private. Hillsdale. Yes, Hillsdale. So that's one. I don't, then they bring in all sorts of speakers who are forbidden on other university campuses, and they critique feminism quite openly. Other than that, the polytechnics, the sort of the 2-year general colleges are no different from the top-ranked Ivy League schools. I mean, I'm talking mainly about Canada and the United States, but I assume it's the same in Australia and in the UK. They all have embraced the feminist mantra. So I know that is the hope of many activists. Recently, many of you probably heard about the Lindsay Shepherd affair at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is a sort of lower tier Ontario university. And a lot of people said, but it's now the lowest ranked university in Ontario, and it's had a decline in enrollment and that sort of thing. But that's an illusion, because it's just as bad at the University of Toronto, where not a single professor would come forward to support Jordan Peterson when he made his first declaration that he wouldn't abide by compelled speech legislation. Not a single professor would stand up and say, I don't even necessarily care about the issue, but I support his right to speak. Not one. And hundreds signed a letter saying he was a danger and needed to be disciplined. And that's supposed to be probably the best university in Canada. So it doesn't matter where you go. They're all deeply feminist and oriented towards social justice ideology on a whole range of issues.
Janice, thank you very much.
Sorry to be so long. Thank you very much.